This playlist collects together and organizes the individual component modules of the first lecture for epistemology. So, welcome. What is this lecture about? Well, this is our first lecture on the Theaetetus, but we're going to start off this lecture by talking more generally about traditional or classical epistemology, what it is, how it works, and the sorts of theories of knowledge that are traditionally offered up by epistemologists. After we talk about epistemology generally, then we're going to turn our attention to a brief biography of Plato, some background of Plato's philosophical orientation and techniques, and then we'll turn our attention specifically to the background context of the Theaetetus. So let's turn our attention now then to traditional or classical epistemology. What we're going to see when we think about traditional or classical epistemology is that epistemologists focus primarily on formulating theories of knowledge. Now, they formulate theories that are pretty unusual in the context of intellectual investigation. That is, they formulate theories that are definitions. And in fact, they formulate really rigorous theories that specify the individually necessary conditions, things that have to be true in order to be knowledge, and the jointly sufficient conditions, the things that are enough for you to have an instance of knowledge. You have to have these things are enough. And that together, that rigorous definition, that is a way of categorizing everything in the universe into is an instance of knowledge, is not an instance of knowledge. So it's a binary distinction that is extremely rigorous, such that it categorizes everything as an instance of or not an instance of. So for instance, when we look into biology, or if we were to look into biology, what we discover is that biologists just don't have that kind of rigorous definition of life. They don't have that kind of rigorous definition of metabolism, of reproduction, of irritability, and so on. Their theories just aren't like this. But this is a very common format, in fact, probably almost exclusively the format of theories within philosophy. So epistemologists aren't out of step with other philosophers, even though the sorts of theories that they offer up are different in form than almost any other discipline or any other instance of a theory that we might come across. The next thing that we want to look at, we want to focus on, is this idea that philosophers think about knowledge in terms of two fundamental metaphorical acts. The individual act of creating knowledge, of forming a belief, of coming to know something in the moment. That's the primary metaphor that most philosophers use to think about knowledge and to formulate theories of knowledge. They also sometimes, but much less commonly, use individual acts of knowledge use, applying knowledge. And so always when philosophers think about knowledge, well, almost always, when philosophers think about knowledge, what we find is they're always thinking about forming a belief or using a bit of knowledge. And those are the two fundamental metaphors, the examples that they think of as their guiding metaphor when they're formulating these theories of knowledge. Now, they also ask a number of different questions about knowledge that go beyond the mere definition. The first is much more like that definition. What is the nature of knowledge? And so we'll look at that question. The next question is a little bit different. It's what are the sources of knowledge for human beings or others? But again, this is about those individual acts of creation. In the moment, what could give me knowledge about the world in this circumstance? And finally, what are the limitations of knowledge for humans? What can I come to know? What is it possible for me to come to know in any particular moment? Now, this last question, the fourth question that is often asked by traditional epistemologists, is a slightly different question. It's a question about the relationships and structures between individual bits of knowledge in our worldview. So this final question kind of steps out of this isolated individual acts of knowledge creation or knowledge use and looks at the overall knowledge structure or the way that individual bits of knowledge fit into our worldview. And it asks, is there a relationship or structure between individual bits of human knowledge? So let's take a look at each of these ideas a little more carefully. We'll start with our theories of knowledge. So I'm suggesting here that epistemology formulates theories about knowledge that have the form of rigorous definitions, and specifically that epistemologists formulate theories almost always that specify the individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for counting as an instance of knowledge. So, for example, the most widely held definition of knowledge claims that knowledge is justified true belief. In order to be knowledge, you have to be justified, you have to be true, and you have to be a belief. Those are all necessary conditions, and jointly together they are sufficient. Any instance of justified true belief counts as knowledge on this view. What about those guiding metaphors? Well, what I suggested was that epistemologists tend to think about knowledge and to formulate theories about knowledge in terms of isolated instances of individual belief formation. And slightly less often, they think in terms of isolated instances of knowledge use. So, for instance, we'll see Plato using this second guiding metaphor. Plato will be thinking about knowledge in the Theaetetus primarily in terms of individual isolated cases of using knowledge in perceptual categorization. So knowing Theaetetus, it gets spelled out, thought about, contemplated in the context of recognizing Theaetetus in the world of sensation. Now, I've suggested there are these four general questions. Now, epistemologists tend to focus most heavily on that first question. They do pay attention to the other questions, though much less so, and their coverage is much more uneven across epistemology. That first question, remember, is what is the nature of knowledge? Now, an adequate answer to this kind of question is going to tell us what sorts of things can be knowledge, and this is something that the definitional theory will do very well. Right? But that also is going to tell us what sort of properties things have to be instances of knowledge. And it should tell us what makes knowledge so good. What is valuable about knowledge that is missing in, say, belief or mere belief or opinion? That second question, what are the sources of human knowledge? That's going to be something that if we adequately answer it, is going to tell us what kind of things can give rise to human knowledge. And more importantly, should also tell us how those things give rise to knowledge. If they can provide knowledge for other creatures then. And what other potential sources of knowledge might we be able to tap? All of these are the sorts of questions, the sorts of answers that we would expect to get from this second kind of inquiry. The third question we said that epistemologists investigate says something like, what are the limitations of knowledge for human beings and others? And so an adequate answer to this third question is going to tell us what, if anything, human beings cannot know and the conditions that would prevent them from knowing. So are there things that we can, in principle, never know? So for instance, agnostics suppose that human beings can never know for sure whether or not God exists or what God's nature is. So this kind of question is going to help us to understand what circumstances are going to prevent us from knowing things, what things we could never know, and so on. Finally, our fourth question is stepping outside of those individual acts of knowledge creation and use and looking at the overall knowledge structure. And it asks, is there a relationship or structure between the individual bits of human knowledge? Do they have some structure that we could call a coherent worldview with important evidential and domain relationships? An adequate answer to this fourth question could tell us about the potential ways in which bits of knowledge can support each other, relationships between domains of inquiry, where a belief is going to likely turn out to impact the way that we should interact with the world, where we can go, what other related domains we should look at if we want to try and find interdomain support for a particular hypothesis, and so on. So that's a very brief encapsulation of traditional epistemology, but it provides us with a little background. And as we go through the term, we'll want to ask ourselves, hey, are we seeing these sorts of themes emerge over and over and over again in the readings and in the lectures? Next, we'll turn our attention to a general background sketch of Plato's life, his intellectual orientation, and the Theaetetus itself.